The concept of Blitzkrieg is that the enemy cannot gain a fresh foothold somewhere and offer major resistance.
It calls for certain elements, above all large armored units that can act operationally with air support. You also need the right leadership culture.
Militarily, the focus is usually on the enemy's capital. To win the war, you have to take it.
It was, of course, important to the Germans to capture Warsaw with as few of their own casualties as possible, but they did so relatively quickly because the Poles' willingness to defend and their morale had already been broken.
During the war in Poland, Hitler had already told his military leaders of his decision to attack France.
The Germans planned to go through Belgium and act as bait, so to speak, for the Allies, but the actual destructive thrust was to take place further south through the Ardennes. It was a huge gamble, and the Germans were lucky that the French failed, tactically and operationally.
Somehow Hitler seemed to have cornered success. And Germany's military leaders also bathed in the charisma which he now exuded.
In the First World War, Germany had fought for 4 years without taking Paris. Now this had been achieved within a few weeks. Naturally, this was a phenomenal achievement that could not only be exploited propagandistically, it also made a massive impression on the German people.
Actually, the Blitzkrieg operations and the whole myth surrounding them showed how quickly battles or campaigns could be won and individual countries and armies defeated. But it was not a concept for winning an entire war.
On May 10, 1940, German paratroops were dropped in Belgium and the Netherlands to seize strategically important airfields and bridges. In the Netherlands, at least, this swift operation was designed to prevent the Allies from intervening and to split their defensive forces. The invaders were successful almost everywhere, although sometimes they incurred serious losses. One of the first targets was the Belgian fort of Eben-Emael, not far from Liège.
Eben-Emael was a fort with a fairly impressive location on the river Meuse. Although it was heavily fortified and defended by a large contingent of Belgian troops, Eben-Emael was captured in Blitzkrieg style. In other words, on a lower tactical level, by German paratroops flown in by glider, who thus helped secure the bridges over the Meuse.
Engineers crossed the river in dinghies.
The main German attack was directed at the Albert Canal-Meuse River line, the anchor of which was Fort Eben-Emael, a modern and seemingly impregnable fortress. The Germans had secretly built a replica of the mighty fortress in Czechoslovakia and had rehearsed the attack until they knew every detail of the fort's construction and its every weakness. When the real attack came, it was foolproof. Parachute troops, dive bombers, flamethrowers, specially trained engineer battalions, all working together as a well-trained team. They knew exactly where to cross the river.
Dive bombers supported the attackers as they tried to storm the fort. Although the commander of the fort had been alerted, the complex was not battle-ready. There was a shortage of ammunition and the fort's artillery couldn't be used.
Neuralgic points had to be neutralized. Airborne troops, of course, were perfect for operational tasks, like seizing bridges and knocking out enemy command posts. A fortress like Eben-Emael, which had to be neutralized, was prepared for everything, but not an airborne assault. The Belgians had no defense against that. They assumed that they would see the enemy approaching and be able to fight the Germans at a distance.
The fort had practically no anti-aircraft defenses. Other units moved up to support the attack. The Germans knew that the blockhouse roof wasn't mined and stormed it. Using powerful shaped charges, they blew up the steel shields around the underground gun turrets. The 1,100 defenders are said to have been practically blinded. They couldn't see the enemy coming in, who blazed their way with flamethrowers.
You will notice that this assault engineer knows exactly where to put his high explosive charge in order to destroy the blockhouse.
The plan worked. The explosions killed large numbers of Belgian soldiers. The surviving defenders holed up behind barricades and waited. Tactically, this was a mistake because it allowed the Germans to set off more explosive charges.
Fort Eben-Emael withstood the Nazi attack exactly 2 days.
Meanwhile, the actual attack in the south was going to plan. Guderian's armored corps had crossed Luxembourg in 3 hours, reached the Belgian border, and immediately launched a mobile assault. The 1st Tank Division was even able to cross the Sauer on May 10th and advance into neutral Belgium.
Zweite und erste Panzerdivision stoßen weiter vor und durchbrechen bei Libramont und Neufchâteau die zweite belgische Widerstandslinie. Die 10. Panzerdivision wird näher an die 1. herangezogen, um gemeinsam mit 2. und 1. Panzerdivision in die Ardennen einzubrechen und auf Sedan vorzustoßen.
Nazi propaganda cameras filmed the first tanks heading towards the Ardennes. The sickle cut developed more and more into a single shock troop operation, a combination of speed and surprise tactics.
The success of the plan depended ultimately on the surprise effect, on the French defenders being caught unawares because they had not expected the attack, and certainly not by such a huge enemy force. As the first operations got underway, it also became clear that the French defenders regarded them as a diversionary maneuver. They didn't believe this was actually the main focus of the German assault. The French were still hoping that the Maginot Line would be the place where the Germans could be repulsed. If the French had to shift their forces to combat the first operations of the sickle cut, it would play havoc with their entire defensive planning.
Erste Panzerdivision erreicht die Semois bei Bouillon. An diesem Tage wurden die Gegner durch den schnellen Durchbruch durch die zweite Widerstandslinie völlig überrascht. Den Belgiern und Franzosen wurde keine Gelegenheit gegeben, sich vorwärts der Maas nochmals zur Verteidigung einzurichten.
Heinz Guderian, the head of the Rapid Forces at Army High Command, had promised his troops that for the first 3 days they wouldn't get any sleep. To stay awake, they were given a supply of a stimulant called Pervitin, but most of the men had to wait outside Bouillon because all the bridges had been destroyed before the Germans arrived.
What do you need to get tanks moving? Obviously, you'd say you need the appropriate infrastructure. But you also need engineers to secure bridges over rivers. The French didn't just retreat, they also blew up bridges and planted minefields, which then had to be cleared. So without engineers, tanks can advance no faster than they can without infantry moving up to occupy the cleared areas behind them. These fast units were indeed a spearhead, but they could only penetrate as deeply as the wooden shaft behind the spearhead permitted.
General Guderian allowed himself to be filmed at an army bridge being built across the River Semois. The Belgian and French defenders had managed to blow up the last bridge just before the first German tanks arrived. But then, thinking they were about to sustain fierce attacks, they had pulled out of Bouillon unnecessarily. In Belgium, the Netherlands and northern France, people fled from the approaching Germans.
And the refugee-choked roads didn't get that way by accident. The Nazis methodically bombed little towns and villages. otherwise devoid of any military value, not so much to kill as to drive the inhabitants out onto the highways. Then, by expert machine gunning, the Nazis would herd them along in terror-stricken flight to hopelessly entangle the advancing Allied armies.
An estimated 8 to 10 million people on the roads led to massive congestion.
Refugees used as a weapon of war, a new low in inhumanity.
It is not clear how many civilians were killed in German airstrikes. The German bombers brought chaos and destruction just to divert attention from the actual war plan. The German spearheads finally reached the forests of the southern Ardennes. They were supposed to have negotiated the difficult terrain already, but the army had been delayed through having to build Bailey bridges. This was not how Erich von Manstein, the innovator of the sickle cut, had envisaged the operation.
The Manstein plan was much better than what actually happened because Hitler and Halder had simply diverted virtually all the armored units through the Ardennes. And that, in fact, was madness because they spent several days stuck in what turned out to be the biggest traffic jam in history.
40,000 motorized vehicles and tanks were waiting behind the spearheads. By now, von Manstein's tank corps was also caught up in the 250-kilometer-long jam. So the general didn't arrive at the Western Front until May 16th, where he was then assigned defensive tasks. His superiors had got their way with Hitler.
Der Manstein-Plan sah vor, dass man zwei Schwerpunkte bildet.
The Manstein plan foresaw two main areas of attack, one through Belgium, in order, as Manstein said, to overrun the enemy and not, what Halder actually did, just bind it. Manstein really wanted Army Group B to force the enemy back to the Somme. The second main thrust was to come via the Ardennes, but not in three surges with huge jams, but in one thrust, which, if possible, would take just one day with armored units. The third error involved something that was also in Manstein's plan, but was not acted on. He had realized right from the start that his flank would constantly be threatened from the south. So to rule out this threat, in Manstein's plan, armored units were to thrust south to nip any French counteroffensive in the bud. Those were his three main points, but actually none of them were implemented. His plan was completely diluted. All that remained in the end was this sickle cut with a massive armored thrust.
Getting an army through a low mountain range is an absolute nightmare for any logistics expert. It involves using numerous minor roads instead of driving across an open plain where the units could develop their full potential. Instead, they were put in a situation which logistically was highly vulnerable. This was something the military on both sides just couldn't imagine. But that is precisely why it worked.
On May 12, 1940, advance units reached the French border. It then took them 4 hours to knock out a frontier bunker camouflaged as a house. Now Sedan was only a few kilometers away. In 1870, in the suburb of Floing, the French cavalry had been destroyed by Prussian artillery.
How did the Germans get through the Ardennes so quickly? Because of a mistake by the Allies. They had just not prepared any real defense of the Ardennes. There were 2 or 3 places where the French, or mainly the Belgian light infantry units, failed to receive the order to retreat. Although these forces were weak, they offered resistance and, in some cases, held up the Germans for half a day. So you can see what might have happened if the Allies had had the right defensive concept for the Ardennes. But they didn't, because right to the end, they did not think it was possible to advance through the Ardennes with large units. When German armor suddenly appeared at Sedan, the French were totally surprised. Their best troops were stationed elsewhere.
Schlechte Truppen stehen.
Guderian's armored spearheads had achieved the improbable. After 160 kilometers, on the afternoon of the third day, they could see the Meuse heights at Sedan. Up to now, in order to keep deceiving the enemy, the German Air Force had stayed right out of the Sickle Cut. But now, Guderian called for air support. Within a few hours, more than 1,200 bombers entered the fray. It was the most massive air raid by the German Air Force in World War II.
The French had only second and third-rate units stationed at Sedan. Even though it wasn't true, when they heard that German tanks had crossed the Meuse, they panicked. But the big problem was that French strategy was geared entirely to sending the best troops to Belgium.
One after another, 4 strongly fortified positions were destroyed by stormtroops who crossed the river in dinghies. With the opposite embankment secured, the Germans could begin building a pontoon bridge. The French artillery desperately tried to prevent sections being brought up. By now, French High Command ought to have realized that this is where the Germans were launching their main thrust. Yet they still failed to assess the situation realistically. Above all, French military intelligence had been found wanting.
Only a few days into the campaign, a decisive battle took place at Sedan. At the very town where the Germans had already defeated the French in 1870, Guderian's tank corps captured the river crossing points and inflicted a major defeat on the French.
On the morning of May 14th, the first tanks drove over the pontoon bridge. The same day, more than 800 followed, along with a further 21,000 vehicles and 60,000 troops. A textile factory provided sufficient protection from French airstrikes. German transport aircraft taking off for Rotterdam, one of the cornerstones of Fortress Holland. The aim was to drop troops behind the lines and capture strategically important positions in the North Sea port. Dutch neutrality was also of little interest to the Nazis. Like the Belgians, the Dutch, they claimed, had favored Germany's enemies. The German paratroopers faced an elite unit of Dutch Marines who put up fierce resistance. On May 14th, an attempt was made to force the city's mayor to surrender, but he refused.
With the airborne operation at Rotterdam, Holland was just a huge diversionary maneuver to strengthen the Allies' belief that the German attack was taking place in the north, and that is where they would send their reserves.
German bombers attack Rotterdam.
Die militärisch wichtigen Ziele der stark verteidigten Stadt Rotterdam werden mit Bomben belegt.
Although the Dutch were now willing to capitulate, the city was subjected to a terror attack. The Germans claimed it was no longer possible to call off the air raid.
Ein großer Transporter steht in Flammen.
The port and the old town were bombarded for 20 minutes. There were no defenses because the Dutch Air Force had already been destroyed. Rotterdam was ablaze. 800 people lost their lives. The world was stunned by such brutality. the defenders of Rotterdam surrendered to the Germans. The following day, the Dutch Chief of Staff said that the one-sided conflict had to stop and announced the general capitulation of the Netherlands. The Dutch royal family and the government fled to London. In the early hours of May 14th, an hour and a half after crossing the Meuse, German tanks attacking at Blitzkrieg speed had already reached a strategically important rise. French units arrived too late and were destroyed south of Sedan.
Guderian's tank corps had achieved its first major victory and was now pushing the French further and further back. One domino after another was now tumbling. What's more, Guderian did not listen to his superior, Gerd von Rundstedt, who was chief of staff of the army group. After the victory at Sedan, von Rundstedt had said, "Now hold still for a while." But Guderian sensed the opportunity that was opening up and continued to thrust further west. This always put him one step ahead of the French.
A French breakthrough could have had a devastating effect on the totally exhausted Germans in the bridgeheads, which were still not secure.
The tank divisions did not wait for the infantry following behind. Instead, they advanced independently. And they could only do that because they had the appropriate mindset, a leadership culture that had been planned in such a way that men thought for themselves. And because their tanks were already equipped with radios relatively early on, this was certainly a tactical advantage. Thus they were fighting against French tank units that were tied far more closely to the infantry, and because they had also lost their leaders, were isolated.
The French surrendered to a superior force, so Guderian's armoured units were quickly able to extend the Sedan bridgehead further south. The French tanks were actually superior to what the Germans had, but they were more ponderous, and because they also consumed more fuel, they had a shorter range.
The French certainly did not lose the war in 1940 because their material was inferior, because their army was worse, too small or poorly equipped. That was certainly not the case. With regard to men and material, the French army in 1940 was totally up to date. It lost the war perhaps because of a lack of resolve. It also lost because its military leadership procedures were slower at all levels than on the German side. And also because the French had no way of combating this new approach to war. They had their own plan for waging war. The problem was that the Germans didn't abide by it. They succeeded in forcing a type of warfare on the French in which the Germans saw themselves as superior. So although the French had the extremely strong Maginot Line and a large air force, as well as large mechanized and partly mechanized units, if they couldn't be brought into play at some point, the French would run out of time. Because by then the Germans would have attained their objectives and it would no longer be possible to stop them.
The French Air Force tried desperately to contain the German infantry that was moving up, and thus to cut off the swiftly advancing tanks. But these were just pinpricks. They had no decisive effect. Nevertheless, the Germans suffered losses. In the end, the Blitzkrieg in France resulted in between 30 and 40,000 German casualties. The exact figures are not known.
Der Vormarsch der 2. und 1. Panzerdivision geht schnell voran. Der kommandierende General setzt sich mit seiner ganzen Persönlichkeit für das rasche Ausnutzen des Erfolges ein und weist den Vorausabteilungen ihre weit gesteckten Ziele an. Da die Franzosen keinen nennenswerten Widerstand mehr zu leisten vermögen, wird in kühnem Vorstoß die Serre am Abend erreicht. Über 100 Kilometer werden im Durchbruch zurückgelegt. Brückenköpfe werden gebildet.
Time and again, the engineer battalions performed superb work. But even so, supplies could only be brought up with great effort. Now, no one could stop the tanks.
Den Deutschen gelingt es mit operativen
With their tank units, the Germans created a main thrust which the French could not stop.
dem die Franzosen nichts entgegensetzen können in der Situation. Da gibt's
One or two critical situations resulted tactically in defeat or delay.
Wo auf der taktischen Ebene es auch Niederlagen
But
oder
basically,
Störungen
German tanks surged through to the Channel coast.
Im Großen und Ganzen laufen die durch bis an die Kanalküste.
Efficient organization was of decisive importance. Throughout the entire advance, transport battalions brought fuel, ammunition, and food by truck to the rapidly advancing tank divisions. At brief intermediate stops, tank crews were handed jerry cans. These pictures were taken by a Nazi propaganda team, but they show what actually happened. To save time, sometimes the jerry cans were even handed to tanks still on the move. Once armored units had started moving, this logistical organization was of decisive importance to the rapid advance. Yet such was the speed of the thrust that even that was not enough.
In the end, the Germans had no ammunition left. One battle report even states, "We had two choices, either to retreat and face destruction or to attack as if we were still strong." And that is precisely what they did. With virtually no ammunition, they mounted a successful assault. The French thought, "Oh my God, the Germans are going to overrun us." So they retreated. It was a total risk.
A British Expeditionary Corps had been stationed in France ever since 1939. It consisted of more than 200,000 troops and over 600 tanks, but they supported the French forces mainly in the north. There was not much they could do.
Die britische Armee war sehr klein und dadurch war auch das Expeditionskorps, das in Nordfrankreich gekämpft hat.
The British army was very small. Consequently, so was the Expeditionary Force, which fought in northern France and Belgium. The British were extremely cautious because they were concerned. If we send too many elite or well-trained troops to France and things go wrong, we'll have weakened our own army to an unacceptable degree.
Ein Maße geschwächt, was nicht zu rechtfertigen gewesen wäre aus britischer Sicht.
The British Expeditionary Force in France in 1940 was certainly a military component. First and foremost, however, it was a strategic and diplomatic commitment. By sending troops to the continent, the British were underlining their intention to continue fighting the war. But in 1940, their troops had to be rescued from the continent of Europe because of the defeat suffered at Dunkirk.
Die Flucht auch dann über Dünkirchen.
On May 17th, Winston Churchill travelled to Paris. He could not believe that the Germans were storming towards the Channel with so few tanks. On asking where the French reserves were, he received the curt reply that there were none left. But the German advance was certainly not the surefire success Nazi propaganda was implying, because there was often fierce resistance at a local level. But countermeasures were unorganized and improvised, the opposite, in fact, of what the French had actually planned.
On May 21st, the German spearhead reached the Channel port of Abbeville. Protecting their flank along the Somme, the Germans fanned out to the north and east. This was to be the perfect battle of annihilation.
On May 24, 1940, Hitler left his headquarters in the Eifel. Together with his entourage, he headed for the part of France that had already been occupied. Field Marshal Hermann Göring assured the Führer that the time had now come for his dive bombers to finish off the encircled enemy on the Channel coast. This final triumph was to fall to the German Air Force, not the Conservative Army. In the afternoon, the tanks were halted. But on arrival at the headquarters of Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group A, this order came as a total surprise to Hitler.
The order to stop before Dunkirk is the biggest myth of the Battle of France. All the generals claimed later that it had come from Hitler, that he had halted the tank units and, as a result, had given the British time to pull back. But that is completely wrong. First of all, the order to halt did not come from Hitler. It came from Colonel General von Rundstedt, who was convinced that the armored units urgently needed a break. They were exhausted. There were problems in providing supplies. The infantry first needed to be brought up, and every day a French counterattack from the south was expected. So Rundstedt said it would be best if the armored units were halted for a while. So Hitler was not even involved. He came and visited Rundstedt, who then outlined the situation, and Hitler merely expressed his approval. That's exactly how I see it, he said. So do it. Lots of generals were up in arms about it, but not all of them. We need to take a close look at all those who, after the war, claimed to have been against it, because many of them actually said, yes, that makes sense.
Meanwhile, on the Channel coast, the Wehrmacht had captured one town after another. Once again, the defenders left the battle zone in a hurry and retreated north. On May 26th, the order to halt was rescinded. But the British and the French had been given enough time to establish a defensive ring around Dunkirk.
On May 28th, the Belgian army, compressed into a small space and weary of battle, laid down its arms. That left the desperate French and British defenders with their backs to the sea at the small Channel port of Dunkirk.
Nearly 340,000 Allied troops retreated to Dunkirk. They hoped that warships would come and take them back across the Channel to Britain.
In Dünkirchen haben sich die Masse der britischen
Most of the British Expeditionary Forces had retreated to Dunkirk in the hope of being evacuated. And the British government and the British military did everything in their power to achieve this. They got together as much transport capacity as they could in order to pick up soldiers and bring them home.
Soldaten einzuschiffen und nach Hause zu holen.
Anything that was somehow seaworthy was used. Pleasure steamers, fishing smacks, and so on. The British people were called on, fishermen were called on, to sail to Dunkirk. There was very little communication and cooperation. It was a chaotic operation, if you like.
High overhead, British fighter planes fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill.
Hermann Göring couldn't keep his promise. His air force could not stop the evacuation.
While below, small Allied side units held the Germans back long enough for the miracle of Dunkirk to take place.
While the battle to crush the pocket was raging all around them, in Dunkirk 338,682 soldiers, 247,000 of them British and 123,000 French, managed to escape in a motley fleet of 861 vessels.
Dunkirk was not only of major psychological and symbolic importance to the further course of the war. The miracle of Dunkirk meant that the core of the British Army was preserved. In other words, the British could continue to build up their army against the possibility of a German invasion, and in the years that followed. Without this nucleus of troops, Britain would not have been able to expand its armed forces.
The soldiers saw themselves as losers, but back home, they were received as heroes. Winston Churchill insisted on visiting the troops personally.
Churchill was convinced that he would have to lead his country through the war to the bitter end, and he was willing to do so. His famous speech, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets," was just the motivation the British public needed.
A few days later, a German soldier filmed the deserted beach at Dunkirk. Evidence of the German air attacks was visible everywhere. The Allies had had to leave behind all their equipment, 63,000 vehicles, 20,000 motorcycles, 475 tanks and armored cars, and 2,400 artillery pieces. The French suffered heavy losses, but they still managed to evacuate over 100,000 soldiers to the ports of Cherbourg and Brest to join up with troops still fighting on the mainland.
It was an operational error that allowed the Allies something no one on the German side had thought possible: the miraculous evacuation of most of the British Expeditionary Force. 88,000 troops were still taken prisoner, most of them French, but most of the British force had made it back across the Channel. No one on the German side had expected this. Hitler certainly hadn't.
But there was no sign of any disappointment when he landed at an airfield near Cambrai on June 2nd, 1940. German soldiers wounded in battle were quickly flown in to serve as the backdrop to an appearance by their commander-in-chief. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "The Führer towers high above us all. He is one of history's geniuses. What a wonderful time this is. It will be followed by a period of great calm, one we all long for, the Führer, perhaps more than any of us."
Dieser Erfolg in Frankreich hat natürlich auch
Naturally, the success in France bolstered Hitler's standing with his military leaders.
gegenüber der militärischen Führung. Also dieser von der Propaganda geschaffene
Coined by the propaganda machine, the term greatest commander of all time was indeed ironic.
Und der Witz drin begründet in dieser Formulierung. Tatsächlich ist es aber so,
Because at the time there was indeed hardly anyone in the German military leadership who was not convinced that Hitler was still a guarantee of military success.
dass Hitler der Garant für militärischen Erfolg auch immer ist.
On July 13th, the French government, which had fled to Bordeaux, declared Paris an open city. The next day, Nazi propaganda celebrated the seizure of the French capital. For the cameras, a Nazi flag was hoisted on the Eiffel Tower.
On June 14th, the Germans occupied Paris. This was a highly prestigious victory, primarily because the French had not fought for their capital. They had declared Paris an open city, practically without a battle. Reports also confirm that the Parisians were relieved because they did not want fighting to take place in their city. All in all, though, it was a serious blow to French morale for the capital to be in enemy hands. It was also clear that the battle for France was now over.
By and large, the Battle of France had gone successfully, although in many places the Germans had enjoyed operational good fortune. And it should not be forgotten that the French had defended themselves well, or that both sides had suffered horrific losses. I think it was of great benefit to the German Wehrmacht that a change of government then took place in France. This at least created political room for maneuver. There was no need to conquer the whole of France, because after the Polish campaign and the Battle of France, the German Wehrmacht was somewhat bruised.
While a pro-German government, headed by First World War Marshal Philippe Pétain, was taking up office, in the northeast of the country, fighting still continued. But it was pointless. One garrison after another had to capitulate. Here, for example, in the small town of Toul on the Moselle River. '84-year-old Marshal Pétain had no choice but to ask Hitler for a ceasefire.
The Battle of France showed that with the Blitzkrieg approach, the Germans could avoid a lengthy war by ending a conflict in the short term. But it also showed that this was not the blueprint for waging a speedy war. It was a blueprint for doing so. So this didn't mean that it would prove just as successful somewhere else under different topographical conditions, with different people in charge and with different adversaries who also behave differently.
In Compiègne, north of Paris, a special ceremony was being prepared. It was at this very location in 1918 that the Germans had to accept defeat, which ended ultimately with the Treaty of Versailles.
Naturally, for Hitler, Compiègne on June 22nd was the fulfillment of a lifetime's dream. Right from the start, he had seen it as part of his political program to revise the shameful dictate of Versailles, symbolized, of course, by Marshal Foch's saloon car, where the German armistice delegation had to sign the armistice in 1918. To expunge this symbolically and practically from the pages of history, Hitler had the railway carriage brought to exactly the same site. The French then had to accept the conditions of the new armistice. This was staged in style, because for Hitler, as for many Germans, this was redressing, indeed erasing, the disgrace of 1918.
Many of the German troops wanted a victory parade like the one held in Warsaw, but Hitler decided against such demonstrative humiliation.
Die Frage, warum Hitler in Paris.
It is still not quite clear why Hitler himself did not take the salute at a big parade in Paris. A lot of it has to do with Hitler himself. He still attached massive importance to coming to Paris himself, very early in the morning, and visiting highly symbolic places like Napoleon's tomb. In this respect, standing as a military leader at the tomb of Napoleon and being able to drive through Paris, he became part of a military tradition. As a soldier in France in the First World War, Hitler had never seen Paris, so for him, also as a soldier, there was, of course, the ultimate satisfaction of finally being able to bring the First World War to an end.
Den Ersten Weltkrieg abschließen zu können.
The armistice conditions were tantamount to capitulation. Nazi Germany occupied 60% of French territory on the European continent, including the capital. The rest was administered by the puppet government of Marshal Pétain in Vichy.
Die Blitzkriege
The Blitzkrieg campaigns and the entire myth surrounding them shows how quickly battles or campaigns can be won and individual countries and armies defeated. But it is not a concept for winning a war, and that is actually the contradiction in the whole Blitzkrieg myth. Everything might have gone successfully from a military point of view, but it did not help politically.
Politisch hat es allerdings nicht geholfen.
Hitler did not plan to rest on his laurels. He planned other Blitzkrieg assaults on Great Britain and the Soviet Union. It was the systematic path to the downfall of a psychopath.